Bars Can't Hold Us by Laura of Machoria. Chapter 3. A few minutes after they took Lance away, Keith's cuffs finally released. Hunk's did not. Keith had been straining against his trapped wrists for so long that he no longer realized he was doing it, and when they let go, he gasped, hands flying upward and almost hitting him in the face. He slumped for a moment, arms aching and throbbing, then looked over at Hunk and found him still kneeling where they'd left him, bent almost double with his head down and his hands still bound to the floor. Hunk. In a flash, Keith crossed the cell to reach him and fell down at his side. Hunk was shaking like a leaf, his eyes closed and face screwed up in a grimace, what Keith could see of it. Anyway. Slow, tentative, Keith reached out a hand and laid it on Hunk's back. Hunk barely reacted. His flesh shuddered a bit at the touch, and he just knelt there, breathing hard. Quiznak, you're shivering. Keith pressed his hand flat against Hunk's back as if he could warm him somehow. Then he remembered the jacket discarded on the floor where they had been sitting. He jumped to his feet and brought it back, draped it over as much of Hunk's back as he could. But Hunk was too large and the jacket was too small. Useless. Not unlike Keith in this moment. He crouched next to Hunk's head, then bent down and leaned over to look at his face. Hunk. His voice was pleading now. Talk to me. Please. Hunk shuddered. His head swung from side to side in a slow gesture of negation. He whispered something that Keith couldn't make out. Keith leaned closer, straining to hear. What was that? Sorry, buddy. I missed it. Hunk raised his head enough for Keith to see again how swollen his face was, the deep black and purple bruises around his eyes, the red scrapes on his cheek and chin. They're hurting him, he said, and if ever there was the sound of weeping without tears, this was it. They're hurting him right now, and I can't make it stop. Anguish rippled through Keith's chest. He drew a breath, then another one. It was hard to control. I know, he said. It hurt him too, but he was humbled in the face of Hunk's utter agony. It didn't seem worth it to mention that he was angry and afraid too. I'm sorry. I wish I could have taken his place. He had tried to give a reason for her to take him instead of Lance, even to send Lance back to the team. He had failed. He had no words of reassurance to give. He had nothing. Keith knelt there helpless, looking at his injured friend as he cried for another friend, and Keith had nothing to offer him. But strangely, impossibly, Hunk mustered up a smile. It was weak and shaky, but still meaningful. I'm sorry, he murmured. I know you hate this too. You're really protective, you know. Almost as much as Shiro. Even though you and Lance like to fight like cats and dogs, I know it's killing you to not be able to save him from this. Keith sucked in a shuddering breath, then fell down on his rear at Hunk's side. He felt limp and exhausted and wrung out. Here was Hunk, bruised and bloody, terrified and desperate for his missing partner, and he still had the strength and compassion to see Keith's pain too and try to soothe it. He shook his head, wordless. Hunk amazed him. Lance amazed him too. Lance had been the most frightened and distraught of the three of them when they were taken like that from their beds in the middle of the night. Keith had noticed that right away, though he hadn't been able to do anything about it. Hunk had tried, in the few moments they had to gather themselves, to try to comfort each other. Then the men with the guns had come for Hunk. The moment the gun stopped pointing at him and he realized what had happened, Lance had released a yell of rage and thrown himself at the door in an attempt to break it down. It wasn't as if Lance's fear had gone away. After they took Hunk, then brought him back bloody and unconscious, the terror in Lance's body language and the wildness in his eyes had only seemed to grow. But it was overcome, subverted, buried in his overwhelming need to protect Hunk, to save him, to put himself in the way of any further harm that could come to him. Lance was just as afraid as before. No, even more so. But he didn't let it control him. He had higher priorities. He felt so much all the time. It worked differently for Keith. Instead of different emotions living alongside each other in his body and him choosing which one to be his guide, he preferred to repress anything that felt uncomfortable or unhelpful. He had gotten very good at it over the years. Too good. Now it wasn't only that he didn't like being afraid. A part of him was literally afraid of being afraid. Of feeling almost anything, really, since any powerful emotion could be uncomfortable, including joy. He would rather be calm and rational. He sucked at it most of the time, but that was what he aspired to. The only emotion he truly considered to be his friend was anger. He could use that as fuel. It bore him up and lent strength to his body when he was tired or overwhelmed, sharpened his mind, and told him where to strike. Anger was useful. Anger was an ally. But right now it wasn't helping. Nothing was helping. Keith's chest heaved, and another wave of hopelessness swept over him. While he was still struggling to deal with this, Hunk had calmed even further. He sat up, as much as the bonds would allow, and sat cross-legged on the floor to face Keith. Distress still lengthened his face and creased his eyes, but his breathing had slowed and the tears had stopped. Here was another way of dealing with uncomfortable emotions. Hunk allowed himself to feel them, totally and completely, let them flood him and take him over for as long as they needed to. Then, when he had acknowledged them and understood them, he let them go. He moved on. It was a remarkable skill, and Keith knew Hunk had gotten a lot of practice with it. It still wasn't any less impressive to witness. "All right," Hunk said almost calmly, though stress lurked under his voice. "We need to think about this. There's got to be something we can do." Keith huffed in frustration, and his eyes went involuntarily to the cuffs that held Hunk to the floor. "What though?" Lance said, "When you fell asleep, he thought you had a plan. But now I don't think they're gonna let you up, man. And I don't know what to do." Hunk's jaw set in determination. "You'll have to meet my hands, that's all." He looked at Keith thoughtfully for a moment. "Do you know any sign language? Even just the alphabet?" Keith shook his head. Hunk frowned. "I'd teach you, but then I'd be teaching whoever is monitoring the cell too. We need a way to communicate that they won't understand, and I'm pretty sure the translation technology will be able to pick up any standard languages from Earth, if we even share one besides English." Keith nodded slowly. He had figured from the way Hunk and Lance had spoken cagily at times that they were assuming that the Malcordans were listening in on them. Probably watching too, judging by how quickly someone had activated Hunk's cuffs when he leapt to attack Corrales. Keith couldn't see any cameras, but that didn't mean they weren't there. Even back on Earth, high-end security cameras were very difficult to spot, and this was an Earth-like but highly advanced planet. Who knew what the Malcordans were capable of? "We need something like a code," Keith said. "Like a verbal encryption. Something that will kind of, scramble our speech a little. Enough that we can understand each other, but the translation program won't pick it up." He sighed, shoulder slumping. "We really should have discussed this before we got into this situation." "Yeah, we'll have to talk about it with the team when we get out." Hunk nodded calmly. Then something sparked in his eyes. "Encryption. That's a good thought. This sounds a little silly, but do you know Pig Latin?" A slow grin began to build on Keith's face. Yeah, it was silly, but it might work. "Ovye Orske. My childhood might not have been ideal, but I was still a kid. Their translation algorithms will probably figure it out eventually, so we should keep it for the most important stuff." "Yeah." A tingle of anticipation passed over Keith's shoulders. This was dangerous. The Malcordans knew what they were doing, what they were planning. They could hear every word he and Hunk were saying, but they were doing something. Hunk had a plan, even if it didn't work, even if the Malcordans activated Keith's cuffs too, and put a stop to it before they got anywhere. At least they were trying. They were fighting. That feeling of helplessness was almost vanquished, just with that knowledge. Hunk nodded firmly, meeting Keith's determined look with his own. "Okay, so first thing, Iwe Adage Ernte Afye Izde Ufske. We gotta turn off these cuffs.
You think you can?
Maybe, but aye idne omse indke afse ulte. I need some kind of tool. Keith hummed. No? Itend pray iste isye otne osable pay. Ake me emthe inkthe isde and play old way irk way. Enze uye and k art stay asing pay. Ise ifye uye and k eindfe umthing say. Pretend this is not possible. Make them think this plan won't work. Then you can start pacing. See if you can find something. Hunk shook his head.
Are you kidding, Hunk? That's ridiculous.
Hunk put pleading in his eyes and expression.
Please, Keith, we gotta try. You know what? No.
Keith jumped to his feet and looked down at Hunk, his hands closing into fists. He was almost shaking now, and he hoped the guards thought it was agitation and anger rather than gold and eagerness.
That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. We need something that will help us, not pie-in-the-sky fantasies. Is that really the best you can come up with?
Hunk slumped against his bonds, his shoulders falling down. His forehead was wrinkled with sadness, eyebrows drawing together.
Come on, Keith. At least give it a shot.
Keith shook his head. Hard.
No way.
He softened his voice and looked down at Hunk with compassion.
Look, I know you're still getting over what they did to you, and you're really upset about Lance. Maybe your brain is a little scrambled. Just sit there for a while. Try to come up with something better. I'm sure you will.
Hunk gave him a watery smile.
Okay. Sorry. Don't be sorry. Just feel better, okay, man?
Keith rubbed his hands over his arms.
I'm gonna walk. Try to warm up. Let me know if you want me to come back to you.
No, that's fine. Hunk sighed. Walk all you need, it won't bug me.
Okay.
Keith suited actions to words. He took a moment to pick up his jacket, which had slid to the floor when Hunk sat up, and draped it over Hunk's shoulders again. Then he started to pace the cell. He needed something Hunk could make into a tool. Or something Hunk could direct him to make into a tool, since Hunk couldn't use his hands right now. Keith already knew from his restless pacing earlier that there was almost nothing in the cell with them. The best thing he could think to use was the metal bed frame in the corner. Maybe he could pull that apart, find a piece of usable metal somewhere. He paced the cell, keeping his eyes on it with each round, trying to study it so he could figure out what to do before he tried it. If he made it too obvious what he was going for, the guards would figure it out and stop him. Then they would take the frame out and remove their last sliver of hope. When his pacing took him away from the bed frame, he used the motion of rubbing his arms to try to study the cuff on his wrist. He tried to see what Hunk had seen, what had made him think that he had a chance to deactivate it. Was there an opening? A catch? Keith couldn't see one. But maybe the indicator light strip in the middle of the cuff. It was lit on Hunk's cuffs, a dull red color showing that they were active as they pinned him to the floor. Might they be able to pry open that tiny light strip? Maybe get to the inner workings of the cuff that way? Keith couldn't come up with another possibility. Alright, so they needed something thin and small to wedge into that tiny gap. Like an X-Acto knife, a small, sharp blade. Keith felt another pang of regret in his chest that when he'd been taken, he hadn't had a chance to conceal a knife on his body. He was never going to sleep unprepared again. If only he had thought about it earlier, hid something in his shoe or an inner pocket. No, regrets were useless. They had to work with what they had. Finally, Keith came to the bed frame again. He paused for a moment, staring at it and rubbing his arms. He breathed faster, working himself up. Then suddenly let out a yell and kicked it with all his strength. He pushed it hard with the sole of his foot, cracking it against the wall. The metal creaked but didn't bend or break. He kicked it again. "Keith!" Hunk called to him, sounding genuinely alarmed.
Calm down, man. It's gonna be okay. We're gonna get out of here, I swear. Please calm down.
No, I will not! Keith spoke through gritted teeth. With each word, he kicked the metal frame again, slamming it between his foot and the wall. Come on, break, fall to pieces. Give him something to work with. Finally, there was a cracking sound. Not the main frame itself, but one of the legs, repeatedly crushed against the wall until something gave. Keith finally let himself stop, panting. The sole of his foot was starting to throb from the hard blows, even through the bottom of his shoe. He stared at the broken metal leg, saw a glimmer of hope in a strip of jagged metal that had split along the break. It was still hanging on the edge of the leg by the corner, but he might be able to break it off with another hard pull. But how to do that without raising suspicion? Keith went back to pacing, in the middle of the cell now, back and forth in tight circuits. He was panting, and his body wasn't as cold after the hard exertion. He swung his arms and tried to think. He was aware of Hunk watching him, only his eyes moving as he followed Hunk's agitated pattern crisscrossing the cell.
Keith, why did you do that?
Hunk asked calmly. Keith heard something in his voice that told him to listen carefully, and he tilted his head, concentrating on the meaning behind Hunk's words.
You should try to put that back together. It was rude to break something that our hosts gave to us, even if we can't use it properly right now. I'm sure they just haven't found time yet to bring us a mattress for the bed. What will they say when they see you've broken it before we even got a chance to use it?
Keith ran his fingers through his hair and tried to draw a breath.
I guess you're right,
he said, putting shame and reluctance in his voice.
That was rude.
He looked up at the corner of the wall, where he guessed a security camera might be.
I'm sorry. I'll try to fix it.
He turned on his heel and went back to the frame, then knelt down by the bent leg. He reached out with both hands and pulled on the twisted metal. The loose sliver came off his hand, and he palmed it carefully. He pushed against the twisted leg with his empty hand and slid the one with the metal back to his shoe, where he pushed the metal strip in carefully between his sock and the leather. Then both hands went back to the bed frame, and he pushed it with all his might. After several minutes of sweating and grunting, bracing the frame between his knee and the wall, he managed to force the twisted leg back into something close to where it had been before. It was still obviously broken, but it stood up again. Not that Keith really expected the Malcordons to ever bring them a mattress, but if they did, the bed should be usable. He stood up and looked at the imperfect frame for a moment longer, then turned to move to Hunk again. He sat down in front of him, cross-legged, mirroring Hunk's position.
I'm cold,
he murmured, and he leaned forward and rested the top of his head on the front of Hunk's shoulder.
Me too,
Hunk said, just as soft, just as gentle. He leaned forward too, head pressing to Keith's shoulder with his face looking downward. They were both hunched over, creating a space between them and beneath their heads that should be sheltered from the camera's view. Keith reached into his shoe and brought out the metal strip to show to Hunk. Hunk caught his breath.
Icene objet.
Soft, almost inaudible.
Nice job.
Keith smiled, disproportionately happy at the praise. It was just a little twist of metal, jagged and broken, and it already hurt his fingers to hold it. As victories went, it was small and pathetic. But it still felt like a victory. Keith turned over his wrist, lifting the cuff so Hunk could look at it, and raised the strip of metal to poke at the indicator light.
Is this?
Hunk hummed, watching carefully.
Maybe.
Keith tried to jab the edge of the metal strip between the indicator light and the rest of the cuff, but the strip was too big. He huffed in frustration.
The floor,
Hunk said. Keith made a questioning noise. He hoped the sounds they were making were cryptic enough.
Ape scrape it ye. Egg may it ye inner thay.
Scrape it. Make it thinner. Ah. Keith shifted surreptitiously, making a gap between his legs and Hunk's. He hunched down further and pressed the metal strip against the rough stone floor, and he started to scrape. Hunk talked to cover up the noise.
Do you think the others are missing us yet? Or is it still the middle of the night? I don't know, my sense of time is all messed up since the whole mind-wiping thing. I think it's been maybe 4 hours since they took us from our beds,
Keith said.
Okay. So depending on what time that was, it might be almost morning, or it might still be sleeping time. Lance and Pidge and I stayed up kind of late just playing around and having fun, acting like it was a sleepover at a hotel or something. There was this weird board game in Lance's room. When we get out of here, I want to find out what the real rules are and try to play it. But in the meantime, yeah, we just made up rules since we couldn't read the instructions, all written in Malcordon or whatever. We played it kind of like the game of life. You ever played that one? Keith shook his head. Okay, so it's just a standard board game with these paths you follow. And all of the squares are life events like graduating high school, getting married, buying a house, having a kid. Your game piece is a little car, and you start with one passenger to signify you, but you can add more for spouse and kids, or whatever. Anyway, yeah, so the game in Lance's room had a board with a lot of spaces, and some big playing pieces that smaller pieces fit into, and some pieces of paper that could pass as fake currency, though I have no idea what Malcordon currency looks like. There weren't any dice or a spinner or anything, but turns out that Pidge always carries a game die in her pocket. Who knows why? She just has a lot of pockets and puts random stuff in there, I guess. So she had all kinds of weird stuff on her when we left Earth. And now she carries a game die everywhere she goes. I would say it's like a good luck charm, but I don't think Pidge believes in luck. Maybe it reminds her of her dad or something. There was a danger of Hunk's voice turning sad at that, so Keith interjected, "So what rules did you make up, since you couldn't read the spaces?" "Oh yeah, all the squares were blank, and we didn't have any paper to make cards with live events or anything, so we made stuff up. Every square was different every time. The rule was that you couldn't make up the event for your own square, though. Someone else had to do it. So pretty quick, it devolved into just constantly sabotaging each other. Like, this square says you have to pay 200 space bucks to the player in last place because you were late on your taxes. Or, this square says the water pipes burst in your house and also your house burned down, so now your house is lost and you gotta move back 3 spaces. Stupid stuff like that." Keith smiled, listening to Hunk ramble. He wished now that he'd said yes when Lance invited him to come hang out with them in his room. At the time, he had thought it would be kind of a better idea to get as much sleep as possible, not knowing what the next day would bring. He didn't get how Lance and Hunk and Pidge could treat this trip like some weird kind of vacation. They were on an alien, possibly hostile planet. Couldn't they see that? Now, though, he kind of understood where they were coming from. Of course they knew. They always knew. It had been a shock to be kidnapped from their beds in the middle of the night. But it was also kind of par for the course on their series of misadventures through the universe. Hunk and Pidge and Lance found opportunities for fun and relaxation when they could, and always grabbed them eagerly because they never knew when they would find them again. Next time Keith would join them. He would have fun making up stupid game rules to mess with Lance. He bet himself silently that he would even be able to make Hunk and Pidge laugh. He wanted to hear that. Wanted to hear Lance sputter in indignation at being forced to do what Keith said. Hunk kept talking, and we kept, putting lots and lots of the smaller playing pieces into the big ones, like the cars with the babies in life. But we had so many of the smaller pieces. It was like we were rabbits or something, just having all the kids all the time. Lance liked that part, though. He said it was more realistic. Only in the last couple hundred years have small families been normal in civilized places on Earth. Usually it's normal to have as many kids as possible because kids are assets, not liabilities. Which makes sense coming from Lance, since he's from a big family and he loves it. But Pidge started arguing with him about the economics of having large families in a modern society, with all the costs of child rearing and eventual training. And they started arguing about the cost-risk benefits of trade school versus graduate school, and man, it was getting heated. The metal strip was wearing down, though not as quickly as Keith would have liked. Still, he knew he was making progress. Just had to keep going. He shifted his grip on the piece of metal and scraped it on the stone, over and over and over. "Who won the game?" he asked. He frowned lightly. Did anyone win the game? He was beginning to doubt. Hunk chuckled, deep and warm. His head shivered against Keith's shoulder with the movement, not unpleasantly. He was starting to lean into Keith more heavily than he had before, though. Maybe his injuries were catching up with him.
Keith shifted himself where he sat to try to offer more support and leaned his own head more heavily against Hunk's shoulder to hold him up. Nah, no one won, Hunk said, humor in every syllable. Unless maybe I won because Pigeon Lance got so invested in running things for each other that they didn't notice that I actually managed to get to the end of the board before they did. But the thing is that usually with life you add up your money and stuff and figure out who won that way. But none of us had any left after making each other's lives absolutely miserable. Keith chuckled too. Maybe you should make an actual game of life to play back at the Castle of Lions sometime and find out who can really win. They already had several decks of cards and a Jenga set, created from various materials found around the castle. Family game nights were fun with the Voltron crew, Keith had to admit. We probably won't bother. Life is kind of a boring game, really. Too much like Candyland. No, the game Pigeon Lance really want to make next is Risk. That's gonna take a while. But I do think they have all the rules memorized between the two of them, though they played with different variations in their homes. They'll just have to figure out a way to codify a set of rules between them. And also maybe smooth talk a rant into helping us make pieces. We gotta have properly balanced dice for a real game of Risk, so we can't just go the handmade route. Karan knows how to fabricate stuff in the workshops on the maintenance level, but we have to get his permission now. After some rather unfortunate incidents early on. Keith wanted to laugh at that, lips twitching up at the corners. Did Pidge try to construct parts to make a robot or something? No, it was me. Hunk's voice was sheepish. Pidge likes to repurpose stuff rather than design her own, so she mostly works with what she finds available. But I had this idea to make a differently shaped nozzle for a fuel container on one of the pod ships. Yeah, did not go well. Did you blow something up? Hunk made an indignant noise. No! Then he calmed and went sheepish again. I, melted something, actually. Keith laughed straight out at that. It was hard to believe how relaxed and comfortable he felt, even in this awful situation, just listening to Hunk talk. Lance had a knack for relaxing people too, but too often he succeeded in getting Keith's hackles up instead. Somehow Hunk never did. The metal strip was almost ready. In fact, it might be ready now. Keith stopped scraping. His wrist tingled and ached from the prolonged movement at an uncomfortable angle. He should stretch out his forearms, probably keep them limber. But first, a look at what he'd accomplished. Wait. The tingling in his wrist was getting stronger. It was in both wrists now. Then Keith heard the buzz that meant the cuffs were about to activate, and he barely had enough time to move them above a open patch of floor where they wouldn't break his legs before they thudded abruptly down and he was trapped there, gasping at the shock of it. His gaze flew in panic to the metal strip lying exposed on the floor between his shin and Hunk's knee. Had they seen? Maybe he and Hunk hadn't been hiding it from the cameras as well as they thought they were. Even as Hunk stared, his mind spinning, Hunk was already bringing his leg forward and pressing it down over the strip to hide it from view. Then Keith heard movement beyond the door, and he swung his head over to stare, panting in dismay. Could it be? Corrales said she was going to keep Lance for a long time. Had it already been that long? It didn't feel long, but Keith had been working pretty hard, keeping his mind and body occupied. Or was she coming to take another one to work on both together? If she really wanted to hurt Lance to punish his insolence, forcing him to watch Hunk being tortured, or even Keith, would be a cruel but effective way to do it. It wasn't Corrales. 2 guards came into the cell carrying a limp body between them. Lance, pale and unconscious, blood painting his face from several cuts and abrasions on his forehead, his cheeks. A smear of red under his nose, bruises already starting to bloom on every patch of exposed skin. Lance! Hunk bellowed, his entire body rigid with shock and distress. He jerked against his bonds again, seemingly without conscious thought, pure reaction to Lance's appearance and Hunk's overwhelming need to go to him. Keith's mouth pulled tight in a grimace of hate, every muscle tight and straining, but he was trapped on the floor too. Be careful with him, he yelled at the guards. Of course, they paid no attention to either Hunk or Keith's shouts, not even a glance in their direction. The guards dropped Lance on the floor in a graceless pile, a tangle of limbs and blood and bruises. Then they dusted their hands off and left the cell as if they had done nothing more than drop off some trash in a bin. Keith stared at the door, panting, waiting for it to shut behind them, for his cuffs to disengage. Again, he was pulling against the bonds as hard as he could, barely aware that he was doing it. It seemed to take forever, several long, agonizing minutes, while Hunk babbled at Lance in a rush of frightened words.
Wake up, buddy, Lance, babe, please, wake up, please, look at me, please, please, please be okay. You said you would be okay, you have to be okay. Don't be a liar, Lance, please.
Finally, another short buzz, and Keith's cuffs lifted off the floor. He caught himself before he hit himself in the face again, and then he was up, scrambling across the cold stone with legs that were numb and clumsy from sitting still for so long. He slid to a stop at Lance's side and reached out for him with shaking hands. Should he move him? What if he was badly injured? Keith didn't want to do more damage than had already been done. But no, Corrales and the guards had already done as much as could be done to Lance. Surely all of Hunk's wounds were surface level, or so he had assured them more than once. Surely Lance's were the same. Please, don't let it be worse than what they'd done to Hunk. He took Lance's shoulders in his hands and carefully turned him over, rolling him so that his shoulders ended up supported by Keith's left arm. Lance's head lolled back over Keith's arm, eyes stubbornly shut, arms and legs loose and floppy on the ground. A pulse of bright red blood leaked out from his nose. He was still bleeding? Keith caught his breath. Hunk had been in bad shape when they brought him back, but at least he hadn't been bleeding. All of his small scrapes and cuts already closing by the time he landed on the floor. Why was Lance still bleeding? His nose didn't look broken or anything.
Lance.
Keith patted his face with shaking fingers, hoping to wake him without hurting him.
Lance, open your eyes, please. Can you look at me? I need you to look at me. Hunk is freaking out, man. You gotta tell him you're okay.
Hunk had been unconscious too, but he had woken up almost immediately, mostly because Lance had been screaming, Keith was pretty sure. With what they knew now, it seemed like Hunk had passed out from the effects of the mind wipe, instead of being knocked unconscious by a strike to the head or other traumatic physical damage. Was it the same? Had they wiped Lance's memory too?
Lance, please.
Keith kept patting his cheek.
You gotta wake up. Come on. Yell at me. Make fun of me for caring about you. Whatever. I don't care what you say or do. Just open your eyes and look at me. Come on. You really gonna keep us waiting like this? Rude.
Nothing. Lance remained limp, draped across the floor with his head bent backwards over Keith's arm.
Keith?
Hunk's voice, urgent now.
Can you bring him over here? Please.
Keith nodded, suddenly unable to speak. His throat was too tight. He hefted Lance up in both arms and half carried, half dragged him over to where Hunk was still trapped on the floor. When were they gonna let Hunk's cuffs go? Were they still punishing him for trying to attack Corrales? He laid Lance down in front of Hunk and knelt on his other side, bending over him to stare into his face.
Lance.
His voice was a choked whisper.
Wake up. Please, wake up.
Hunk hunched over him as much as he could. His eyes were brimming with tears.
His nose is still bleeding, he murmured.
Keith nodded.
Yeah, I noticed. I don't know what that means. Some kind of hemorrhage? Usually nosebleeds are pretty minor injuries, just some burst vessels inside the nostrils. But if it's been going on for a while...
Keith took in the blood smeared on Lance's face, his clothes. The new blood under his nose drips down his chin, his neck, his shoulder, and chest. Dried and drying and wet. Yeah, it did seem like it'd been going on for a while. What did they do to him? Keith's hands curled around Lance's shoulders, helpless and frustrated. He wanted to shake him, but if Lance had some kind of unknown head injury, he'd be doing a lot more harm than good.
Lance, come on. Please wake up. Keith?
Hunk was staring at him, eyes fixed and focused. Keith could feel the gaze on him, the intensity. He slowly raised his head and looked back into Hunk's face, and he tried not to flinch at the earnest plea he saw there.
You remember how I said you'll have to be my hands?
Keith swallowed. He nodded. Hunk's face was regretful.
I'm really sorry to ask this, man. I don't want to make you uncomfortable. But please, I need you to try to wake Lance the way I would, since I can't. What do you need me to do?
It was a bare whisper. Hunk gave him a strange smile.
Nothing too difficult, I hope. Just stroke his cheek. Press your hand against it. kiss his forehead, maybe. Would that be okay?
Keith's chest felt hollow and cold, but he nodded. He turned back to Lance and bent over him again. Hunk talked above him, giving the soothing words that Keith was unable to supply.
Lance, please wake up. Please wake up, buddy. It's time to get up. We're getting worried, sweetheart. We're getting so worried.
Keith stroked his cheek, gently brushing his fingers from Lance's nose back to his ear, over and over. The skin under his hand felt too cool for human norm. Lance's body probably in shock from whatever they'd done to him, but it was still warmer than the air of the cell, so he knew Lance was alive. Alive and breathing, human and vulnerable, so small here, so small and hurt, so vulnerable under Keith's touch. He laid his palm against Lance's cheek and pressed it there, and that felt warm and intimate, too, in ways Keith had never thought to experience. He didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know if he was doing this right. He didn't know if he was doing anything right.
Come on, babe, Hunk said, almost a prayer. Time to wake up. Time to open your eyes. Beauty sleep is over now. We're waiting for you. We're all waiting. Time to face the day. I know it's hard. It sucks, but you gotta. Please, Lance. Wake up now.
More blood trickled out of Lance's nose. Keith held his breath. Lance's eyelids twitched, and his breath halted for a moment. Then his chest convulsed, his shoulders jerked against the floor, and he suddenly bolted upright and almost knocked foreheads with him. Keith clenched his teeth and leaned back, unable to do anything but watch as Lance doubled over, hacking and coughing. Lance's entire body shook, and it was not a gentle tremble. It was harsh, violent, just shy of convulsions. Keith gripped his shoulder, trying to hold him steady, and Hunk leaned closer. He obviously wanted to lean his head against Lance's, but couldn't while he was shaking so hard. The coughing was awful. A low kind of wet gurgling caught up in it, thick and viscous. Not like a sick cough, like Lance had a cold or something. No, somehow this seemed worse, sounded terrible, painful, and disgusting and traumatic. Finally, Lance hawked up a big wad of something in his mouth and spat it out between his legs. It was blood.
Lance!
Hunk's voice, Keith's voice. They blended together, distress and fear and sympathetic pain. Lance sagged, tipping to the side as he lost strength. He slipped away from Hunk's loose grip and ended up caught, drooping on Hunk's arm, which was still bolted to the floor. Hunk's face was almost comically desperate. He so badly wanted to catch Lance, support him, hold him up. But he couldn't. Keith had to step in. He saw Hunk looking at him, his eyes pleading. So he reached out.
Lance.
He kept his voice quiet, trying to be gentle.
Hunk can't hug you right now, so I'm gonna do it instead, okay? I'm being his hands right now.
Lance made no response, just let out a painful-sounding wheeze. His entire body heaved as he tried to catch his breath. Keith wrapped his arm around his upper back again, found a grip on his opposite shoulder, and slowly, carefully pulled him in. Lance let himself be manhandled, limp and apparently exhausted. He sagged against Keith's body as Keith's arms folded him up, forehead resting on the side of Keith's neck. His skin was cool and clammy, and it felt supremely weird for Lance to be so quiet and still. Keith firmed his jaw and held on to him, unable to do anything else. Gradually, Lance's breath smoothed out, though there was still a bad wheeze underneath. He kept swallowing against the blood draining down the back of his throat. He was still bleeding. Keith considered holding his nose for him to try to shut off the flow of blood, since Lance seemed too weak and confused to do it himself. But he didn't want to hurt him or scare him. Maybe they should wait it out. Surely it couldn't go on much longer. Hunk kept talking the whole while, low and soothing and gentle.
You're okay. You're okay. Glad you're awake, Lance. Good to see you again. Glad you're here. Sorry you're not feeling good. Everything's okay. You're gonna be okay. We're all gonna be okay. Shiro's gonna wake up and realize we're gone, and he's gonna be mad, and Pidge will figure it out right away. Seriously, she and Shiro will ask to see the security footage of the halls, and it doesn't matter if they erased it. Doesn't matter how they tried to hide what they did. Pidge is gonna find out. She's gonna find everything out, and then she and Shiro and Alora and Karan are gonna come down here and wreak merry hell amongst these scumbags. Just you wait and see. We're gonna get out of here, and you're gonna be fine, and everything's gonna be okay. I promise, Lance. I promise.
Lance shuddered, fists curling in his lap. Keith held him a little tighter. Then Lance started to shake, gently at first, then harder. Keith pulled his face back, tried to look at him and see what was going on, but Lance's head was ducked down, face hidden from Keith's view. Hunk shut his lips and stared at him, eyes wide. Then Lance lifted his head. He was laughing. It was kind of horrible, creepy. His mouth was open and his teeth were bloody and red saliva hung off his lip. But it seemed like a genuine laugh somehow. He sounded truly, honestly amused by something. Keith's arms tightened around him almost convulsively, compelled to try to keep him still, keep him from hurting himself. Had Lance gone crazy all of a sudden? Had whatever they'd done to him broken his mind? Or had the mind wipe gone really, really wrong somehow?
Lance.
Hunk sounded scared. Lance opened his eyes and turned his head to look at him. The weird laughter calmed down, slowing to little hiccups that shook his shoulders and jarred his chest. "Sorry!" His voice sounded rough and choked, but he was still grinning with bloody teeth. "It's just pretty funny." He sounded like himself, strangely enough. Keith pressed his hand to Lance's chest, trying to keep him upright as he continued to droop.
"What is?"
"They messed up!" Lance turned his head to grin at him too. "They messed up so bad!"
"Who?" Keith blinked, unable to believe what Lance was saying. "The Malcordons?"
"Yeah!" Lance laughed again, then started to cough. He fell forward, almost doubling over, but Keith caught him with an arm across his front and held him upright. Lance coughed hard for a few seconds, then spat more blood on the floor between his legs, scattering red and viscous against the dark stone. He sagged in Keith's hold, limp and drained. Keith pulled him sideways to rest against him again, Lance's bony shoulder digging into his chest. Lance let him do it.
"Lance."
Still so much fear in Hunk's voice, but a different kind now, and Keith couldn't blame him. He felt the same.
"What did they do to you? Do you remember it?"
"Yeah." Lance swallowed against the blood jerking in Keith's grip. He wasn't trying to get away from him, just couldn't stop his body from reacting. He went still immediately afterward, leaning on Keith as trustingly as a child. "I don't know if they tried to erase my memory. If so, it didn't stick." Hunk frowned. He obviously wanted to ask more, pursue the possible reasons for that, but he didn't.
"What happened?"
he asked neutrally, though the calm was forced. They knocked me around for a bit to start with." Lance raised a hand loosely in the air and flapped it around. It almost seemed like a casual gesture, like he was passing off being beaten as something that didn't matter. Hunk and Keith both knew the truth, though. Hunk because he knew Lance, and Keith because he could feel his trembling intensify. Keith said nothing, just held him tighter. Hunk's frown deepened. Lance paused. He swallowed, then spat between his legs again. This time it was a little more clear, though still mixed with red. "It didn't seem that serious. Like, Corrales wasn't even in on it, just a few guards. I was strapped in this chair, like they have at the dentist, kind of, except even more serial killer-ish. And several dudes took turns hitting me, but their hearts weren't in it. I don't know. It was like they knew they had to beat me up, because it was expected, so they did it. But it wasn't the main event. I could tell. They didn't even ask me any questions, because they didn't care." Lance's tone indicated that he was trying to make light of this, but Keith didn't think that really made it better. Worse, maybe. That kind of callous indifference, along with cold, almost institutional abuse. It was worse than hatred. Like Lance didn't matter. His pain didn't matter to them. Nothing mattered but getting what they wanted, and they would do whatever it took to attain their goals, including kidnapping and torturing their guests, their potential allies, obviously. Keith shuddered. Lance caught his breath at the motion, then blinked and went on. So then Corrales and this lady in scientist clothes came in. Like, not a white lab coat because that's an Earth thing, but you just know it's the same. Corrales made a gesture, telling her to do her thing, and the scientist and a guard rolled over this huge machine to the chair where I was stuck. It looked like something out of a mad scientist lab in a cartoon. All big dials and readouts and prongs sticking out of the top. And I might have made a joke about how dumb it looked. So Corrales made another gesture, and one of the guards cracked me a good one across the face. Keith bit his lip to keep from interrupting. He wanted Lance to cut to the chase, but he also knew that sometimes Lance needed to meander around the point. The descriptions of the scientist's clothes and the machine and all that weren't necessary, but they gave Lance time to work up to the difficult parts. It was Hunk who prompted Lance to go on when he paused for a moment, staring into the distance.
Then what happened?
His voice was very gentle, but there was a hint of urgency underneath. They needed to know. Oh, yeah. Lance shook his head, coming out of it, and looked back to Hunk's face. The machine had this sort of headset thing, kind of like the headsets back at the Castle of Lions that we used during mental training. But this one was bigger and had more wires and junk coming out of it, and it looked, I don't know, it looked scary. I heard this buzz, like the cuffs before they activate. Electricity, I guess. And the scientist put it on my head. I tried to fight it, tried to shake my head and get away, but a guard held me still and I couldn't.
What did it do? Keith asked, his throat tight with dread. What were they trying to accomplish?
Lance laughed. It was harsh and short and carried very little amusement. This wasn't funny, not really. But Lance used humor as a defense mechanism, always had. That's where they messed up. They messed up bad. They were trying... You'll never believe this, Keith. They were trying to study the bond.
Keith blinked. The bond? Wait, the lion bond?
Yeah! Lance laughed again. He choked and went still, and Keith braced himself for the coughing to start. But Lance held it off, held himself rigid for a moment, then went limp again. The electricity! It was like they overloaded my brain. It hurt. Really bad. I don't know if you've ever been shocked, but man, it's bad. And it kept going on and on. And it seemed like it was getting worse, not better, and I couldn't make it stop. I couldn't make it stop. I was begging and they wouldn't stop.
Lance.
Hunk leaned his head forward, slow, a gentle fall, and rested his forehead on Lance's shoulder.
Lance, buddy, it's okay. Breathe.
Lance did. He sat there in the circle of Keith's arms, pressed between his two teammates, and he breathed. Eventually, he gathered himself. He lifted his hand enough to curl his forearm around Hunk's head, though he didn't dislodge Keith's arm from around him. And he started stroking the hair on the back of Hunk's head softly, almost dreamily. He stared away at the other side of the cell. Okay, he said. Okay. Keith's chest hurt. He wanted to kill every single person who had ever laid a finger on Lance in his entire life.
Tell us about the bond,
he said, voice rough and shaky. Right. The bond. Lance drew a breath that shifted Keith's arm around him, shuddering low in his chest. So the power, whatever they were doing to me, I think it was some kind of test, like when the doctor makes you drink a chemical so they can watch where it goes in your body. They were trying to, literally see the bond between me and Blue. The scientist lady kept saying stuff about getting a reading and tracing topography, and obviously none of it made sense, and I couldn't even hear her well at the time because I was yelling too much, but yeah, I think that's what they were trying for.
But they made a mistake,
Hunk said. Yeah! Lance tried for a laugh, but it came out cut off, almost inaudible. The, power! It didn't just trace the bond or whatever, it supercharged it!
Your bond with Blue,
Keith repeated, trying to figure out what that meant.
It got supercharged.
Yeah! Lance grinned, wide and bloody and gleeful. She heard me! Blue knows! I'm not saying Shiro made the wrong call, deciding not to bring the lines down to us. The Melchordans probably would have tried to capture them too. Maybe even succeeded. But it sure was inconvenient being out of range of the castle. I haven't been able to talk to Blue for days, and man, I missed her. But the Melkordans made a mistake and supercharged the bond, and now Blue knows. She's up there, and she knows. A sudden fire lit in Keith's chest. Now he understood why Lance had been laughing. He kind of wanted to laugh too. The Blue Lion knew. It definitely sucked that she had probably been alerted to the situation by hearing Lance scream in agony through the bond. But now she knew, and soon everyone else would know too. They were getting out of here. Sooner rather than later.